Kasmi. It's time to move on in the agenda. And now I give the floor to A.WARE, who was the strategic head of the ICJ line of research. Aline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Gaillard. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for people who have waited until we finished the previous session. The session is starting a little bit late, but we hope that you found if you managed to capture some of the previous session, the excitement that the students bring to the learning they had from the summer school. And that sort of relates a little bit more to other work of the Normandy Chair for Peace. And of course, some people have been here for the entire 3 days of the Normandy Chair for Peace final event and have learned a lot of the exciting work that's been happening through the Normandy Chair for Peace on climate justice, rights for future generations, and other really important law regarding environmental issues, indigenous issues, and protecting planet Earth for current and future generations. So I have been working with Normandy Chair for Peace primarily on the climate justice issue. The main area we've been working on for that is this campaign, which has now succeeded in getting a case into the International Court of Justice, an advisory opinion approach on the issue of responsibilities to protect the climate for current and future generations, and to address the impact that climate change is already having. In addition, there were some other elements to the climate justice program, and one of those which we'll also talk a little bit about today is the Earth Trusteeship Initiative, which is looking at an important model for our relationship with the Earth. It's not new. Earth trusteeship principles have been around since probably humanity has been around, but they're not the predominant paradigm. They're a predominant paradigm in a lot of indigenous law, but not so much in the modern law. And the Earth Trusteeship Initiative is rediscovering, reframing, building together the different examples of Earth trusteeship and seeing how important this is in order to protect the environment, again, for current and future generations. But firstly, we'll start on the ICJ climate case. We have some incredible people with us today who have been working on the program. Normandy Chair for Peace has just been one of the initiatives that's been contributing to this incredible initiative. We have here Christopher Bartlett, who's the climate diplomacy manager from Vanuatu, who has been leading the diplomatic initiative to get the governments at the United Nations to agree with the United Nations resolution to take the issue of climate change to the International Court of Justice. We also have SCHNAKENBERG, who is one of the co-founders and team leaders of World Youth for Climate Justice. This effort to get into the International Court of Justice has been led by youth and by leading that is in a range of different ways, in inspiring people to see the importance of this issue, in engaging youth, in engaging governments to work with the youth on this, and looking at the elements of law that can go into this, and cooperating on the process. And then we also have Professor Nicholas Robinson, who's our Chairman Emeritus of Normandy Chair for Peace, and a distinguished Professor of Environmental Law, and a Professor Emeritus at Pace University. And Professor Robinson has a very good overview of the importance of legal approaches to do with protection of the environment and how they can fit in with policy development. And then we also have Nishan Gunasekara, who is a lawyer from Sri Lanka, now living in Sweden, who works with me on the World Future Council on highlighting best policies for current and future generations, and is also the chair of the Earth Trusteeship Initiative. And I think, who's not here yet, but is probably going to join us, if I'm correct, Emily, is Munir Saturi, a member of the European.
Hello.
He's not already here with an announcement. Yes?
It has been frozen for a second, but so we have Christina Vogt, with whom we recorded a message about the written submission that she is preparing as a chair of the World Commission on Environmental Law of the IUCN. and there will be a surprise at 5:30, so we will have to respect the timeline for the EU deputy. At 5:30, he will take the floor online.
Thank you, Emily. Now, I suggest that we ask Christopher to speak first because I believe Christopher's coming in from Vanuatu and it's 1:20 in the morning there. So Christopher may want to speak and say a little bit and then head off to sleep and not stay. So Christopher, why don't you give us a little bit of the excitement that's happening and the success that's happened so far with this initiative. And what is the lay of the land at the moment with it, and then after you will go to Yule, who can talk a little about what the role that youth played to get us to this place. So Christopher, how about you go first?
Sure. Thank you so much, Alan, and thanks to all of you for joining this session. And what an inspiring summer school. I mean, I am just amazed at the work that you all, the students, have done. Congratulations to the Normandy Chair for Peace. What an incredible initiative. And I guess I'm really excited because young people have really played an essential part of this entire initiative, right from the very beginning, when it was students from the University of the South Pacific that brought this initiative to us in the government of Vanuatu and really convinced us to take the leadership required to get it across the line. And of course, the work that was done by young people during the political advocacy. I mean, the fact that 132 nations co-sponsored this resolution is very much due to the pressure that young people around the world put on their governments. And I think they should be very, very proud of that. Also, the work that young people are doing right now in the writing of submissions. So they've put together some incredible tools and guidance and advice, which is actively being used by governments as they prepare their submissions to the court. And I also know that young people are going to be directly involved in using the advisory opinion once it's released by the International Court of Justice. And they're already thinking ahead about what that means in terms of contentious cases or litigation. So, I mean, this is truly a young person's effort through and through, beginning to end. So congratulations to all of you. I suppose where we are at the moment is we are now engaged in the process of the court. And as you know, there is a deadline whereby states can provide written submissions to the court, answering the two questions that we've resolved together at the General Assembly to ask the court. The first question is around the obligations that exist under international law on states to protect the climate and other parts of the environment. And the second question is, well, what are the consequences, the legal consequences, when states have not met those obligations and they actually do cause significant harm to the environment? And in both questions, you find references to future generations. So again, a very much a young person's initiative. Now, we are a little bit worried in that we know that those states who are absolutely going to participate in this process are going to be states from the global north, historical emitters who have very little interest in seeing a progressive advisory opinion. So what we're really aiming to do, and what Vanuatu is engaged in at the moment, is encouraging, inspiring, motivating, providing resources and support for countries of the global south, those who are particularly vulnerable, who are not historically responsible, and who have everything to lose by continued emissions of fossil fuels. We got some bad news just a few weeks ago that OPEC has just been authorized. This is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, has been authorized by the court to provide a submission. So we really need to provide a balance to that potential harm of those legal perspectives. And that's absolutely what we're engaged in at the moment. And I just maybe will close by saying that this is not the only space where we need to use all the levers and tools of international law. So an advisory opinion will be incredibly helpful, and I hope that it's used to maximum effect when it comes out. But I'd also like to recall, that there are other spaces in Vanuatu, even though we're a small country and we don't have nearly the resources of other nations, we are absolutely punching as hard as we can to use international law. We're taking the issue of ecocide to the International Criminal Court and trying to amend the Rome Statute to include ecocide as the fifth crime, along with crimes against humanity and genocide and others. We're also, of course, fighting very hard in the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention process, to set up a new loss and damage fund, which is based on the principles of polluter pays and climate justice. we are fighting at the Assembly of International Seabed Authority to unequivocally ban deep sea mining so that there's no excuse to exploit and damage one of the last remaining ecosystems on the planet. And then, of course, we're also leading the charge to develop a new fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which really gets to the root of the climate crisis. So while the ICJ is critical and we're so excited that there is now momentum and that states are committed and preparing these submissions, we know that this is not the end of the journey. So thank you so much, Alan, and the rest of the team. Thank you, Normandy Chair for Peace.
Thank you so much, Christopher.
Thank you so much. And just to mention to people, if you've got any questions as speakers are speaking, the chat doesn't seem to be enabled yet for everyone, but I believe the question and answer box is enabled. So if you put questions in the question and answer box, and then we can address them as they're coming along. We're trying to get the links to both the Vanuatu webpage, which is excellent to everybody, as soon as the chat box is enabled, and also to the ICJ International Court of Justice page itself. Both of them are actually easy to find and Google, and they're really good background. If you go Vanuatu ICJ, if you Google that, you'll come up with the Vanuatu page, which has the UN General Assembly resolution and an overview of the campaign. And if you go to the International Court of Justice webpage, that's icj-cij.org, and then just click on advisory opinions, pending cases, you'll come up with the website for this particular case. And you'll see all the information that has been received by the court so far for the case, and which are the organizations, the international organizations that have been accepted to be able to provide information to the court, in addition with UN member states. And so all UN member states are able to put in submissions. International organizations have to request for that, and then the court makes the decision on a case-by-case basis whether they will accept information from the international organizations. As Christopher mentioned, OPEC has just received permission, so they will be putting forward, of course, the submissions are going to be protecting the fossil fuel industry. This part of the case, the written submissions, is then followed up by responses to the written submissions, and then it's followed up by oral hearings. So here is all the time where we can encourage our governments to get in really good submissions to the court, and only those who put in submissions in this phase get to answer the submissions put in by others. So it's important to sort of get in there. So that's just a little bit. Christopher, thank you so much to yourself for all the passion and energy that you've been putting into this project. Also to Vanuatu. And this has been an incredible endeavor for a country that doesn't have a lot of financial resources. Vanuatu is not a rich country and compared to some of the other bigger countries, and yet has been the country that has led this initiative, worked so hard to build up the support from other governments around the world. And this is no easy feat to do that. And in order to be able to get, as Christopher mentioned, 132 co-sponsors for the GA resolution, and then the resolution adopted without opposition. This provides a really good basis, not just to ensure that that the court is paying attention to this in a really serious manner. And I think that the fact that the resolution was achieved without opposition is part of why the court is opening up to the full, much fuller array of submissions than it has in the past. I mean, it's seen that this is an issue that's important to everybody, because there hasn't been opposition to the GA resolution. But it also means, which we have to think about, is when we get to the deliberations and the decision of the court, that's not the end of the story. We're going to need to pay attention to the decision that comes out and then ensure that it's implemented. So all the things that people are putting into this case now are also paving the way for when the decision comes down to ensure that it impacts on policy, because that's the objective, is to ensure that the law that the court is going to lay down, the legal obligations, both the negative obligations of stopping the destruction of the climate, but also the positive obligations of moving to fossil fuel economies, of repair if possible, of addressing the impact. All these are elevated at the global level, at the highest possible level with the most impact, and that's all what this is paving the way for. So sorry, I'm taking up a little bit of time that I should be passing on to other speakers. I know Nick Robbins will speak a little about this, Yuli will as well, so I'll pass on to Yuli now, because as Christopher said, this has come from youth, of course supported by those of us who aren't so young, maybe young at heart, but it's been driven by youth, and that energy and passion and commitment and expertise from youth has been incredible. So I'll pass on to Yuli now, who will say a little bit about how this has happened and what is the continuing engagement of youth in this initiative. Yuli.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And I know I have a difficult last name, so when you struggled earlier, I feel for you, absolutely. Yeah, it's a German last name, so that's where I was born, but joining today close to the Peace Palace, actually, in The Hague, so I can almost see it when I lean out the window. And I have the honor to represent World Youth for Climate Justice. So that's the network of young people that responded when the Pacific youth that had initially approached different Pacific states, including Vanuatu, when they had, I think back then that was COP25 in Madrid. Salman, one of these very first law students who was working on this initiative, he met other young people from around the world and said, if we want to, this is, soon right now, it's that in the Pacific, but this has to become a global initiative. We need young people across the world to lobby their own governments, to be involved and build also very much that public narrative. So the kind of the legal, there's a lot of legal interest, lawyers are really into this case, throwing around arguments back and forth, risks, all of this. But I think very much what youth and other civil society organizations, starting from the Pacific and then it went global, they've done a fantastic job in building really a narrative around this case that goes beyond it being a technical legal matter, but really being, I think, a movement to kind of take back the court, make this a people's court and a case where people can partake and feel reflected and heard in the process. And yeah, I think I have to return the thanks that Chris gave all of us. I always feel your energy come through the screen, even if it's 1 a.m. in the morning for you. Yeah, I think the Pacific students, without their leadership and without the kind of being taken serious from day one, I think this would have never gone so far. So I really appreciate that. And of course, there was a couple of years of hard work and not just since 2019, but of course before that, also that led up to this very spectacular moment in New York. But going forward, so there was a lot of youth and civil society effort, and going forward, when states can draft these very lengthy technical legal documents, young people and civil society, the frontline community members, we encourage, and we don't just want to kind of wait and see what states submit and then see what they say in the oral hearings and then move to the implementation that both Alan and Chris have mentioned, but really be an active part in the process. And so Chris had mentioned that we're also providing arguments and resources, and Vanuatu, of course, that's their own work in behind the scenes and in public. But we've created a handbook, and Alan, maybe you can even put the link in the chat as we speak. Thank you so much. You always do a great job in that. We call it the Youth Climate Justice Handbook, and we use this to, when we approach states here in The Hague, there's a lot of embassies who are here with those who will be drafting and then sending back and forth to the capital. We approach them, and a lot of states have maybe never engaged, and especially those voices that Chris mentioned that we need to kind of drown out those who will bring forward their fossil fuel interest, or kind of that the fear of having to pay up. Those states who are not like that, they might never have participated, they don't have the resources, the time, the lawyers to kind of work do all that very lengthy research. So they can take the handbook and then use that as a starting point, and it reflects interests from young people that are grounded in climate justice. So one part is the written proceedings, and then the oral phase that Ellen also mentioned. That's when, and living in The Hague, I get to all these dreams and visions of how I think we'd like to see it happen, because the courthouse is quite exclusive, I think, to most people who aren't international lawyers working for governments. You don't really know what's going on, when these states are, how it works. And I think what we very much want is that young people, and not just young people, but of course people who are in particular ways impacted specifically and marginalized because of climate change, that they can become part of these state delegations and appear with their own governments to address the judges, to deliver a witness statement. So be an active part in the oral proceedings, and then also witness it. We want the young people in front of the courthouse, cheering, watching, discussing what's going on, and making those demands very clear. And also something I think that we, thinking about the next few months when states are drafting these written submissions, just to get back to that quickly, the process is a bit different in all countries, and it's not really a public or transparent process in how these are being negotiated, or how they're even drafted, and who gets to input and who then has to approve it, which ministry. And so we encourage young people who are watching, or if you are a government official, doing it the other way around, kind of reaching out to your government and saying, okay, what's the process and how can we be involved? If you're going to be submitting these arguments on behalf of millions of people, what arguments are you making? Are you making them in favor of your own young people? And especially with all these climate litigation cases around the world going on, where governments are being sued and they are losing, like in the Netherlands, where they have to step up their mitigation targets, for example, or the implementation of their targets. That they are in a position that they really have to show their young people what they are submitting. And so kind of being maybe a bit of a pain, if you have to be, to make sure that that we know what's going to be in the submissions, what are maybe red flags, how can we have an input, can youth statements be included in that official submission, can maybe kind of a youth statement and evidence interview, that lived experience, be annexed to the actual state submissions. There's a couple of different ways, but for sure kind of the reflection that those are people, real people, and young people who are who will be most impacted of what the court is saying, but are also kind of demanding this from their own governments to be a part of this. So I think there's a couple of different ways how we have done this in the past, and a couple of different ways how we're looking to be a part of this process in the future. And I invite you all on board on this journey. But I think most people who are here are already, and it's always great to see familiar faces. So thank you very much, Alan, and I'm happy to answer any questions if that was too fast. And I apologize to the translators for the habit of speaking really fast.
Thank you very much, Julia. And it's really good that you mentioned a little bit about this part of the process, the written submissions, and encouraging there be youth voices in the written submissions. The importance of these submissions, what goes into them is there are a number of different aspects. One is the facts, the science, what is happening. The earth is burning. We know it is. This is coming from human-created climate change gases, and those facts are very important. There's also the law, and what the International Court of Justice can draw upon, and probably Professor Robinson will say a bit more about this, is not just agreements, because sometimes the agreements like the Paris Agreement and what's agreed at COP are the lowest common denominator. It's just what you can get the governments to agree on, and they've got all these counter influences, including the fossil fuel industry. No, the law goes beyond that, because the International Court of Justice, Neshna may say a bit about this also, draws upon a range of sources of law, and agreements, treaties is only one of them. Customary principles of law, which is so important in this. The teachings of the most respected jurists and legal experts, and also the opinions of civil society and population. These are all part of what is the crux that the judges can consider. So this is why youth voices actually have not just like a value of saying, hey, here's what you think. It's actually something which the judges need to pay attention to, and that's really important. But to get these submissions into the court can be a bit. One, of course, try with your governments, but if the governments, not everyone has access to be able to reach their government. If it's difficult to reach your government, find a local parliamentarian who might be able to help you. And because parliamentarians can raise questions in parliaments, for example, what is our government going to be doing? Are they going to put in submission to the court? What will they be putting in the submission? And that can help also make the process a little bit more accountable and not just behind the scenes. So that's why we've also been engaging very much parliamentarians in this process, and we're very happy that later on in the session we will be joined by a parliamentarian. So those are some of the aspects. I'm going to pass on now to Professor Robinson, but just before I do that, I want to recognize I see someone who's here with us, and that's Tony Oposa from the Philippines, who was one of the co-creators of Normandy Chair for Peace, and also one of the inspirations behind youth picking up this idea, because it was students of Tony Oposa who, when he talked about this idea, were amongst those that started in the Pacific Island students fighting climate change to take forward this idea. And Tony's been a support, encouraging the young people all along in this. We thank Tony very much for his inspiration, and he's been part of the process, as has the Normandy Chair for Peace, been playing an inspirational and supportive role in this process. Now I'll pass over to Professor Nicholas Robinson, who is also one of the key people from Normandy Chair for Peace, an expert in the area. As I mentioned, he's the Chairman Emeritus of Normandy Chair for Peace. So Professor Robinson, can you give us a little bit more about the importance of the advisory opinion, how this plays out, what is the way the judges might look at this, and anything else that you might like to offer to reflect on this? And thank you so much also for your engagement in the process and your expertise. Professor Robinson.
Well, thank you, Alan, and thanks to everyone who's gotten us to this point, because it's a very exciting moment in I think the history of the world, not just questions of law or environment. And just to give you some historical perspective, there was a time when the University of the Pacific did not exist. We had an entire movement to create higher education in the South Pacific. It had been neglected, if you will. And so it took some time for that to happen, to give us a pool of students from the South Pacific who could then take action. So I think we're riding on the success of those who started the university. In my case, I am leading something called the International Council of Environmental Law. In 1969, when it was created in New Delhi, there was no environmental law. It's pretty audacious to create a Council of Environmental Law for something that doesn't exist. And so when we talk about the trusteeship initiative and so on, that Nishan will talk about, this will exist, I hope, inshallah. And the whole point of thinking in an intergenerational way is that we are benefiting from the investments that have been made before us, and we can't forget that. It's a very important component for building forward. One of those investments was made by a young lawyer in the Philippines, Tony Oposa, who brought the first case on behalf of children and future generations and to establish the right to the environment. And that case, Oposa versus Factoran, is still one of the leading authorities for where the law that the International Court of Justice will apply is derived. And of course, Justice Hilario Davide Jr., who wrote that opinion, was inspired and very thoughtful in that he reached beyond the current constitutions. He reached beyond the written laws or treaties back to the origins of civilization. And he found, if you will, in natural law that there is, predating the written law of people, a fundamental right to the environment, a right to live, a right to clean air, a right to clean water, and to enjoy the biodiversity which surrounds us and of which we are a part, if humans come out of nature. That decision, of course, came about the same time as the Supreme Court of India and Pakistan and other South Asian high courts were ruling that, yes, there is a right to the environment. They found it sometimes in the Constitution and other places. But there is now, all around the world, a national recognition in virtually every country that there is a right to the environment. And the UN General Assembly last year found and recognized, on the advice of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, that there is a human right to the environment. So we have a very strong predicate of rights going into the submissions that will be made. For those of you who haven't read it, the Youth Climate Justice Handbook is a very good summary of the law. So the law students or young lawyers who prepared that clearly get it, and it's a very valuable tool. What we have right now, it seems to me, is, as Vanuatu and others have said, 3 stages of legal and social development. The first stage was that which the World's Youth for Climate Justice and Vanuatu and all the rest of us who worked on the General Assembly was to get the referral to the ICJ out of the General Assembly. And as everyone has said, that was a great moment of success, but it just set the stage for the second phase that we're in now. And ISIL, the International Council of Environmental Law, is actively working with some of the landlocked states in the South that don't have access to the oceans, some of the high mountain states in the Himalayas and so on, because their impacts from climate change are different than those of small island states or coastal states. And we have to encourage these countries to participate and make submissions. And part of that is to show the court that climate change is not just one regional activity or damage or issue. It is a global issue with different manifestations in different places. So the submissions need to make clear to the court the harm and injury which is now being incurred everywhere, but it's different everywhere. It's the same everywhere in a sense, but we feel it in different ways. So we need to articulate and document that so the court can see this as a biospheric concern. It's not a north, south, east, west concern. It's a concern for life. And that's why people refer to it as an existential concern. But that's going to just set up the third phase. And the submissions need to think about the third phase, because as Alan said, people are thinking about what happens after the ruling. You want your submissions to be clear about some of the remedies that are necessary. So we plant the seeds for a debate after the court rules on the remedies. So think about after the submissions are in January and there's been a rebuttal to those and the court rules. Well, number one, now we have an inventory of national policy positions on climate and the obligations. So we've never had that before. We have a vote in the General Assembly, but nations don't have to articulate why they vote in a certain way. But for the court, the submissions will articulate and explain their positions. So we can come back after the opinion to the capitals of these countries and know exactly the points that we have to argue with them. And the youth and the universities and the environmental law community and the public generally will have an opportunity to engage in the reform of those national policies at the national level, based on what the countries submitted and what the court has said. The next thing we have to plan in that third phase and anticipate by making suggestions are what are the remedies we want to come up with. The court is unlikely to fashion some remedies, but they'll create the predicate for that. So the youth and the activities that youth will have after the decision are what Tony Oposa calls activities of hope. And in hope, he redefines the words, heal our planet Earth, H-O-P-E. So the youth will be able to articulate, the environmentalists and so on, the urgency of hope. And that will create hope in the more traditional sense. Secondly, we'll be able to go to national courts and apply the international ruling under national law. And the courts have been the major change agents. And since the right to the environment exists in each state, the courts will be able to interpret that right in light of the International Court of Justice ruling. This is very important because we might not agree with everything in the International Court of Justice ruling, but we do have the right to the environment, and we can reinterpret that in a national context. The third area is what kind of diplomacy will result. And the first area of diplomacy is going to be in the General Assembly itself, because the General Assembly can have resolutions presented to make remedies, to take responsive actions to the decision of the court. The General Assembly has plenary authority over these issues. And for instance, in the case of the law of the sea, the General Assembly is mandated to advance the progressive development of the law of the sea. We know there are tremendously dangerous heat waves underwater now, as bad as the heat waves on land. We know that the absorption of carbon dioxide is causing an acidification of the oceans. There's much that has to be done, and the General Assembly has to not just debate the same issues of the past on oceans, but take up the new issues. And this will apply to other areas of the commons, the atmosphere, and so on. And then we have the UN agencies, the specialized agencies, UNESCO, the International Labor Organization, the World Meteorological Organization. All of these bodies will take guidance from the decision of the court because it will apply universally. And so the states that are represented in the Food and Agricultural Organization have a special interest in the biodiversity and the pollinators and so on, the clean water that helps maintain our food systems in the world, our farming systems. And so we need to focus on each of the specialized agencies as to what remedies that group or individual agency can provide. And just to plant some seeds, what am I talking about with remedies? Well, we know that we're not going to phase out fossil fuels instantly because states are dependent upon them in dangerous ways. So what if we had an obligation to make a fee? You want to use your resources, you must pay to use them. We're going to have a surcharge on your use of fossil fuels, and that surcharge will be paid into a fund which will go to help mitigate and adapt to the damage of climate change, to help people move further away from floodplains or away from coastlines that are going underwater, to help people migrate from one place to another, both within a country and across boundaries. If we had a large pool of resources, of money, we can begin to address those impacts. And what happens if we said this fee is going to increase every year? So we set it this year, and next year it's going to double. And the next year it's going to double again. And the next year again. So we're creating an incentive on countries, if they want to save money and not spend wasteful money on fossil fuels, to begin paying their way out of fossil fuels to save those additional fees. There have been many talks about a transfer fee that could be charged just for moving a fossil fuel across a national border. Now, national legislation will probably have to be used to implement a fee system like that, but it could come, and it can be commended and recommended by the General Assembly. You could also have an international agreement to do it, and you could have a regional agreement. Just as after the nuclear weapons case, we have nuclear-free zones all around the world, we could have in different regions around the world a regional fee system, such as I've described, created by treaties of those countries. So the fossil fuel exporting countries would have to pay into that kind of a fund. Now, these are creative ideas that need to be debated, that need to be thought about. We need to work on other ways to incentivize the use of alternative energy systems. But above all, our remedies need to be equitable. They need to deal with the fairness problem that many of the countries of the world, virtually most of the countries, did not create the crisis of climate change, and yet they are suffering as all countries suffer. So the resources and the flow of resources from the affluent part of the world to other parts of the world has to be created. We can call for it all we want, but now we're going to have a legal decision that gives us the basis to create the new remedies. And this is exceptionally important. This third phase will continue for many years after the ICJ decision. But the ICJ decision is so fundamentally important because it sets the ground foundation for that phase 3. Phase 4, I hope, is we finally get ourselves out of the climate crisis and we've adapted to live in a new world a new climate change system, which is very different than the one we had when I was born, but which will support biodiversity and life in new ways. So, Alan, those are some of the thoughts. The law is very clear. There's not a lot of law on the subject, and therefore it's easy to have the Youth Climate Justice Handbook lay it out. ISIL is about to issue a note that will have the same sort of approach, but emphasizing some of the fundamental principles that could have precedence over others. One of those is the one I mentioned and spoke about here at length, and that's the right to the environment. But there are several others as well: solidarity, resilience, and so on. So thank you so much. As Julia, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I think we want to use our time and get on to the next speaker.
Professor Robinson, thank you so much. Thank you also for the reminder of people to put in questions. I already see one in the Q&A box, so I encourage people to add some more, and then we'll come around to those very soon. You know, this event today is part of the 3-day event of Normandy Chair for Peace. You know, we were supposed to be reporting about all that we were doing, but we're sort of doing a little bit more to demonstrate what we've been doing. So for this program, we have been bringing together activists, youth, law professors, people involved in environmental organizations, in order to assist, you know, bring forward these principles of law protecting future generations, but with a particular focus on the climate issue, because there's an opportunity with this and taking the case forward. So we're sort of doing a bit the same today as what we have been doing over the past couple of years, which has been bringing people together in online webinars, trying to educate those who may not know about these, how they can become engaged in this. The webinars we've been doing have touched on things like why International Court of Justice is important, what impact it can have, what are the sources of law that can contribute to a case on climate change. Emily is putting up the actual web page on the Normandy Chair for Peace website, so you can see support for the campaign to actually ensure that we can get to the court. And then, as what Professor Robinson's been talking about, it's not just getting to the court, it's ensuring we have a good result from the court, and then we follow that up with ensuring that it impacts on policy. So we've had webinars on those. We've also had one on bringing different aspects of the principles of law into the court, such as rights of future generations, which Emily will talk a little bit about later, and the specific event we did on that. And the other part, which you sort of inferred a bit, Professor Robinson, is part of implementing whatever policies are going to come out, we're going to need better environmental governance. It's not just at the national level, it's at the regional level and at the global level. And there are governance models like Earth trusteeship, for example, that need to be brought to the fore. And that's a bit of an introduction to the next speaker, who's Nishan Gunasekara, who is an expert on the International Court of Justice, used to work for Judge Weeramantry, who was formerly a judge on the International Court of Justice, so follows very closely how the court works, but also not just the International Court of Justice itself, but other judicial bodies like the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, where, for example, there is also a similar case at the moment, and how they will play off against each other, and how these principles of environmental governance, including Earth trusteeship, can be elevated in the courts in order to assist with taking forward sound governance and implementation of the remedies, or possible remedies that Professor Roberts was talking about. So Nishan, give us a little bit more about your thoughts, ideas about how this could play out and how these ideas can come into the court with remedies and have an impact on policies.
Thank you, Alan. Aibowan, Wanakam, Assalamu alaikum, and good evening, good morning to everyone. Great honor to be here, and thank you very much, Alan and Professor Emily Gaillard, for the invitation. Congratulations to the Normandy Chair for Peace. An incredible effort, not just the summer school, but I'm just listening in onto the wonderful video of the emotions of the young people that came out. I think augurs well for an inspirational journey ahead. And also to be on the dais with Professor Robinson and Senior Tony Posa and others is an incredible amount of work. And I would really share some observations. I think most of the key aspects have already been set forth. The law, the young people through the Youth for Climate Justice Handbook, and Professor Robinson has set it out. But the first is, I think, I agree with Professor Robinson. We really need to know how the past informs us so that we can take proper and informed decisions today so that the future to come can benefit from it. And I think there's a lot more effort that can go into the past, present, future discourse. And on this, I really want to build on the spirit of Judge Veeramantri, who really opened up the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice. And Professor Robinson alluded to hope, and I wish to draw from that. And the work of Tonio Posa 30 years ago in the Philippine Supreme Court, which informs us today on rights of future generations, and the wonderful work that Professor Gaillard and others have been pioneering in this front. And the environmental movement that Professor Robinson was alluding to obviously goes back before my generation, and it's going to be around for generations to come. But Alan, something that you've inspired also in me, I must mention, is the wonderful efforts that you've taken with the International Court of Justice, whether it be the nuclear test cases, but pushing the knowledge that the International Court of Justice is not just meant for international lawyers or a group of diplomats representing the interests of nation states, but that it's a global institution really standing for peace. And I think here work of many of the those who have been involved in the process to say that the International Court of Justice is actually a global institute for peace needs to be reminded. And I think Judge Veeramantri then unpacked utilizing international law as an instrument of peace. And I think that allows us this opportunity, because before the International Court of Justice, we had the Permanent Court of International Justice under the League of Nations. And that was 101 years ago that was established. Of course, it was wounded up in 1946. But there is a lot of jurisprudence that we can take heart in the engagement of what we today call modern international relations, giving over the state sovereignty to the institutions that necessarily has to give an opinion that has an impact on the whole world. And I fully agree with what you said, that the sources of international law needs to now be built beyond the nation-state system. And as beautifully coined by Professor Robinson, it is no longer sufficient for us to be only thinking and determining, working in nation-state mindset. It has to be earth-centric. And the legal provisions are therefore needed to be brought into play. And here, you've already mentioned the sources, that it is not just what we find in the conventional treaties and documents, but it's also in the customary principles, and you've unpacked Article 38. And I've read the wonderful source of the World Youth for Climate Justice Handbook. I'd love to see the references to Judge Veeramantri's dissenting and separate opinions in quite a detail. But also one other perhaps seldom mentioned statute provision, which is Article 9 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, which deals with elections of judges to the court. And we know we have 15 judges coming from different parts of the world. But this Article 9 also talks about that these judges necessarily having to represent the civilizations on the planet, the key legal principles and legal systems on the planet. And it is not restricted, therefore, to nation-state systems, but a broad body of law and jurisprudence we need to draw from. And here, for my observations for the kind of the second phase of this historic opportunity with the advisory opinion on climate change at the ICJ, is that I think we need to put every effort to bring in the voices of young people, but also including those of indigenous groups, because I think the wisdom already contained and it informs the jurisprudence of the court. But it is not enough. They have to be represented, heard at the International Court of Justice at the heard. It is absolutely imperative that we get this right now, and we don't go bogging down into the nation-state system. So we need to put effort and pressure, supporting Vanuatu and the others to bring these voices to The Hague. by the ways of another wonderful word that I'm kind of dwelling in from Tonio Posa's exchange recently, is about dreaming. It's about dreaming the ability for the voiceless to be brought here so that the International Court of Justice can come out with an advisory opinion truly representative of planetary systems, of indigenous systems, who, as we already know, have existed in Earth trusteeship with each other for countless generations. And just to touch upon 2 points on the governance, Alan, there is an incredible amount of work inspired by what I heard from Professor Robinson and Tony and others, that is informing the current day multilateral system. And I know you're leading on various efforts with the UN Summit of the Future coming up next year. But specifically on rights of future generations, Professor Robinson already talked about right to a healthy environment and the constitutional provisions that are already there that needs to be utilized. But also the right to future generations, going back to kind of the government of Malta coming before the General Assembly in 1988 to recognize climate and rights of future generations. And the development since that time allows us this opportunity to really challenge the way governance mechanisms interpret these things. And on one side, we have the United Nations systems recognizing various things, including this May, picking up on this momentum, the high-level committee on programs, which informs all of programs in the United Nations, have drafted the principles of future generations, which needs to be necessarily incorporated in the decision-making of the UN system. And then we have kind of the modalities for setting up the UN Summit of the Future next September, which allows us to unpack the work that Professor Robinson and others have inspired of the generations, allowing us a conversation on Earth trusteeship, which is now building beyond only the human-centric, but into the Earth-centric systems of governance that we are required. And here, I think I just really want to kind of capture saying that the Ubuntu wisdom of I am nature and therefore we are nature is something that needs to really inform our day-to-day discourse in governance mechanisms. And the trusteeship working group that you are also a key part of is trying to bring this paradigm of rights of future generations, both in a human-centric but also in an earth-centric way. And the academic world has just got together over the last 7 years and also spearheaded something called the Maastricht Principles of Human Rights of Future Generations, which also takes inspiration from what Professor Robinson and others have been doing over the last 60, 70 years. And I think it is important that whilst we try to bring pressure on governance mechanisms, that we heed to wisdom from the ages gone by as we inform the future. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Nishan. And you mentioned about a principal objective of the International Court of Justice is to assist the peaceful resolution of conflicts. And there is a project which is taking forward that peace aspect of the role of the International Court of Justice called Law Not War, Legal Alternatives to War, which is focusing very much on a better use of the International Court of Justice and enhancing its jurisdiction. And the link to that is put in the chat box. Also on the governance issues, you mentioned a bit, some of those are of course being brought to the UN Summit of the Future, also been expressed through the Climate Governance Commission. And I put the link to the Climate Governance Commission in the chat as well. Please also note that the question that was asked by Rebecca Schutt from Citizens for Global Solutions United States, there is a start of an answer to that from Christopher in Vanuatu. So please check the question and answer box. We will probably circle back to this as well because it's not fully answered by Christopher. And that because Rebecca's question was, are there structured mechanisms to maintain strategic engagement through the policy cycle, especially in situations where different state actors may be responsible for promulgating versus executing policy. This question is actually the subject of an entire webinar in itself, because it's looking a lot at how we take on the decision from the court once it's delivered. And we will be circling back on this at a future event. So we're only just giving samples or teasers at the moment to answer or address this very big question that Rebecca has asked. And Chris has put in a little bit there with regards to the current stage that we're in, ensuring the involvement of civil society voices in the submissions. Now we're actually going to have a short video statement from Christina Voigt, who wanted to join us but had to catch a flight. I'm going to pass over to Emily to introduce this, and then this will be followed up by a short presentation from Emily on the International Court of Justice case on climate change and rights of future generations, which has been another strand. So Emily, can you introduce the video? We don't have any sound coming from the video.
Welcome Professor Christina Voigt. She's Professor of Law. So I've just been informed that the microphone was unselected. I was muted. You didn't hear me. Okay, so okay, I can send the video. I present her on the video. Okay. So welcome again, everybody. We are very pleased and honored to have the opportunity to welcome Professor Christina Voigt. She's Professor of Law at the University of Oslo, and she's also the chair of the World Commission of Environmental Law of the IUCN, which is one of the major partners of Normandie Chair for Peace. I have to say that many events were organized. It was with their support and with also the colleagues from the World Commission of Environmental Law. And even if Professor Voigt has a very hectic agenda, she's with us again for the last day and for the closing event. So please, Christina, can you tell us what is doing now the World Commission on Environmental Law about the ACGAO? Anyway, the floor is yours. Welcome, Christina, and warm thanks. Thank you so much, Emily, and a warm hello also on behalf of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law to this closing event of the Normandie Chair of Excellence for Peace. It is, of course, with a little sadness to say hello to the closing event, because it has been 4 years of very close collaboration, as you said, between the Normandie Chair for Peace and the World Commission on Environmental Law. Before I answer your question about what we're currently doing, I would like to use this opportunity, Emily, to congratulate you and all the people, your colleagues involved with the Normandie Chair of Peace for 4 years of important and unparalleled work. You've really paved new grounds on many different issues, be it bioethics, be it future generations, rights of future generations, be it rights of nature, be it linking peace and environmental protection through law. And it's not only that you paved new ground, but you always did it with optimism and by building a positive narrative. And I see here our dear friend Tony Oposa coming into the picture, and I was just about to thank Tony so much and wholeheartedly for his intellectual leadership and for his heart space, for his wonderful motivation that he has been providing to everyone involved in working with him. So thank you for your visionary thoughts, and Tony, and all my best to you. And thank you, dear Emily, as Scientific Director of the Chair of Excellence for Peace, for your wonderful work for those 4 years. For the World Commission on Environmental Law, it has been a pleasure. It has been an honor to collaborate with the Normandie Chair for Peace, because it first happened through my predecessor,
years that I've been running the commission. And we are currently working on a collaborative project, publishing a book that came out of a joint conference on environmental legal indicators together with Professor Michel Prieur. And as you rightly said, the journey will continue, and it has to continue. We will never be finished. There's always another important issue on the horizon, or many at the same time. And the most prominent one, as you already indicated, is of course the advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the question of states' obligations to protect the climate system and other parts of the environment, and with particular focus on present and future generations. And it was already a good story, I guess Tony agrees, when the United Nations General Assembly earlier this year, by consensus, adopted the request to the court, and the court is now reaching out to parties. We'll hope there will be another good story coming out of it. We don't know yet, of course, when the court will render the advisory opinion, but we do know that currently the deadline for the written statement is in January. And as you perhaps know, the IUCN, the International Court of Justice, was kind enough to authorize the IUCN to furnish a written statement. The court thought that the IUCN would be helpful in providing input to these proceedings, and we are of course thrilled and humbled by that authorization to the court. WCL, the World Commission on Environmental Law, is currently preparing a first draft. We are working with a relatively small group of experts from the climate change law specialist group under the World Commission, and I'm trying to navigate through these waters, and we will, try to reach out to partners in due course to get additional input. It is an important moment. It's an important time when suddenly climate change has come to the level of international courts. It is, of course, not only the International Court of Justice, but it's three other courts that currently deal with climate change: the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea in Hamburg, as well as the Inter-American Court on Human Rights in Costa Rica, and the European Court on Human Rights in Strasbourg, who has a number of contentious proceedings, not just advisory proceedings. So there's a lot happening currently at the level of international law, and that's fascinating. And it is paying witness to the fact that the science is clear, but the political momentum is lagging behind. And here the question is, what is the power, what is the role of law, the whole spectrum of international law, be it human rights law, be it customary law, be it law of the sea, to really push forward on states' obligations, and of course also on the question of legal consequences in cases where states do not comply with their legal obligations. You asked what the World Commission is doing. Well, this is one thing we're doing. We're doing many more things. We're working across the whole sphere of international law, but we're putting submissions to all of these international proceedings on climate change. We're trying to emphasize several things. We're looking at the illegal treaties that exist in that field of climate change law, whether it's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and Paris Agreement, trying to clarify their legal content. But we do, of course, much more as well. We're helping in the interpretation of other international law, human rights law, law of the sea, in the interpretation in the climate change context. These are all living treaties. They all have to be interpreted in a contemporary manner, taking into account the best available science and, of course, other relevant rules of international law. And, of course, we're looking at the customary principle of prohibition of significant transboundary like to wrap up here, Emily. It's just been wonderful working with you for those years, and I can't really fathom that they're over. I don't think they're over, and I hope we find other ways to collaborate with you, with Tony. Of course, we work with Professor Robinson, who is a member of the steering committee of the World Commission as former chair of the commission. But at this moment, I would like to wish you and your team, Tony, all the best in all the endeavors that will come. And most of all, I wish you many, many good stories.
Thank you so much. I think I will explain also how we met first, because it was also related.
Sorry. Maybe I would just say that we met first with Christina Vogt in Hawaii during the World Congress, UN Summit Congress. And I don't see myself. Maxime, je me vois pas. And she has been amazing. We were expert at a moot court, international moot court organized by Professor David Foreman. And non, c'est bon, c'est bon. In Hawaii, and in this moot court, we were at the Supreme Court of Hawaii with Justice Wilson, Michael Wilson, Professor Robinson was there, Christina Vogt was there, Lisa Robledo from the Philippines was there, another justice from Russia, and we already were involved in this project of ICJ in 2015, 2016. Then Tony did a conference in Harvard University with NCP and Boston School of Economics. So it's a tremendous and collective journey.